So tonight we are going to talk about complex trauma, which is the result of an extremely stressful event or events that shatter your sense of security, making you feel helpless in an unsafe world. Traumatic experiences often involve a threat to our lives or our safety. However, that is not always the case because any situation that leaves you feeling overwhelmed and isolated can be traumatic. There does not have to be physical scars in order for an event to be distressing. Your responses are normal reactions to an abnormal experience.
So could neglect be considered a type of complex trauma?
Yeah, absolutely. Anytime that we may be abandoned, our basic means for survival are not if nobody's coming to a rescue, if nobody's helping us when we're helpless and small and coming to comfort us and self-soothe us, change our diaper, feed us, comfort us when we may not know what's going on, that is definitely would be considered neglect.
Mm-hmm. So it really seems like complex trauma can have lifelong consequences in many areas.
Absolutely. It can affect us emotionally, psychologically, and physically. And, I can start to share a little bit about how it can affect us emotionally. So the most typical response immediately to a traumatic event is when we experience shock and denial. Shock is the rapid and intense disturbance of normal emotional states that leaves the individual feeling confused. Denial is when we don't want to actually acknowledge that this event has occurred. So it's a very avoidance technique and tactic.
So is that kind of like dissociation?
I do think that there's different parts of dissociation. Some are less severe, like daydreaming can be a mild form of disassociation. And other parts are more extreme where we disconnect from how we feel because the emotional pain is too difficult to bear. So, that's an interesting question. And I don't know that it's so black and white. And not really convinced that it may be a form of disassociation, but it could be a mild version or moderate version of that. So when we look at how else we can be affected emotionally by trauma is by feeling sad or feeling really hopeless. Particularly if we knew somebody that got hurt, or our lives in general were harmed by a certain event, whether that's verbal, physical, sexual abuse or natural disasters or being partly in a war zone. You may experience guilt, believing that somehow you are responsible for the event or that you could have done more. It could also be where you experience survivor's guilt, as why did I make it and they lost their lives, and that can be very torn. Shame may rear its ugly head, and most of us have experienced that, and because of intense feelings or fears that we can't control anything anymore because of this incident that happened, which was not expected. You can have persistent feelings of shame, which can disturb our self-perception. You may have persistent fear that the same thing will happen again, or that you will lose control, or that you'll break down. So, it really makes us hypervigilant. hyper aroused. And we may even avoid or just try to numb out by substances, by alcohol or drugs.
Which I feel like would then also probably take a toll on how you feel about yourself and regulating the emotions, that you're going through.
Yeah, I definitely think so. I think it certainly disempowers us for sure. And we lose a lot of our self-esteem, because of the behaviors. But then we may be unaware that we're experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder. Just kind of find ourselves in, a cycle that we can't really step out of.
And often the toll that, drugs and alcohol take anyway, alcohol is a depressant, so it contributes to feelings of depression that people are experiencing and or anxiety, which then just becomes almost like a terrible cycle, using and then feeling terrible and shameful and then continuing that, the next night or day or whatever.
Right. The roller coaster that puts you on.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And it's illusion, alcohol makes us believe that we are in control. And it actually takes away all our power, and we become very avoidant and then don't know how to separate ourselves from emotional pain. And we just kind of bury ourselves even further. And I think when the anxiety comes in is that we have this persistent fear that the same thing's going to happen again and again. And there's this perceived threat, right? So we're constantly on edge. And like I said, hypervigilant, that if any noise happens or the slamming of a door or someone raises their voice, it sends us back and we're re-experiencing that event, even though we're not actually involved and it's not happening again.
And then your body is experiencing the physiological reactions that occurred in that original event.
Exactly.
And it's not, you're reacting in a way that's above and beyond what the current situation is. And you go into fight or flight. But at that point, it's not related to the current situation.
Exactly. And like it's our emotions are not matching the situation, which is like, why is someone's emotions so escalated when the event may be something so small?
And I think that ties a lot into the psychological things that are going on with them as well.
Absolutely.
Like you mentioned, the disassociation, so kind of, emotionally being out of it, but psychologically you're actually splitting your awareness. So although you may physically be in one place, you are mentally somewhere completely different, which kind of, hurts then how you're reacting to something. And if that was your coping mechanism to kind of get through a particular trauma, if that event happens later on in life, you may slip into that and not even realize that you're doing it.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
And you brought up some really good points about revisiting experiences. So like the flashbacks that you would have, just, anything, like you said, slamming a door could all of a sudden, that noise would trigger something. And it's really hard when you don't know what those triggers are until, unfortunately, they happen.
Yeah.
So then you're kind of completely off your balance because you're not really sure what's going on, and you're thinking of something, but you're, not in that place or not in that situation anymore, but you're kind of playing tricks on yourself. Your brain's kind of, playing a little trick.
Right. Right. And I think a lot of times too, the primitive brain has been triggered, right? And like you said, like Nicole said too, it's fight or flight's kicked in, fight, flight, or freeze. And we're just in survival mode there, and we can't process any feelings. And like Samantha, you were saying, we don't even know our triggers.
Right. I think especially for a kid, when we talk about complex trauma, it can happen at any point in your life, but when it happens in childhood, and those are the years your most formative years, that you're developing your emotions and you're kind of trying to figure out what's right and wrong, and what is okay. When a complex trauma happens, like neglect or some form of abuse, it really alters how you then think of situations and how you relate to others. And that can have a huge social effect on your life as a kid, and your life down the road too, if you don't get the appropriate services to kind of help you figure out where your brain got a little mixed in where other kids your age may not be.
Mhm. I think that's a good point, that a lot of it hinges on the social supports that children have or don't have, and or services that are put in place or not in place, that can affect the outcome of experiencing trauma at a young age. If those things are in place, the child has a lot better opportunity to recover and grow and go on to live successfully. If those things aren't in place, then it causes lots of challenges in that time in their lives, and as they get older.
Right. And Nicole, you were saying physically, their fight or flight. That's a big part of kind of how they protect themselves moving forward.
Absolutely.
Their behaviors, acting out, all of the things they kind of do when they don't know how to, discuss their emotions.
And when at such a young age experiencing complex trauma, it can essentially rewire your brain so that your brain does not develop in the same way that a child of a similar age who has not experienced that type of neglect or trauma, the way their brain develops. So the child may have lots of physical effects, may have stunted growth and development, may have challenges with learning to speak. We've seen in many cases children that are neglected do not grow, and go into failure to thrive simply because of neglect. So there's lots of physical ramifications when children are young and being abused or neglected, but then as individuals grow, and if they haven't gotten the support and services that they need, there are physical ramifications as you get older. As we talked about before, going into that fight, flight, or freeze, not knowing your triggers, you can react, in ways to situations that are not in line with the situation. There's also, recently I was reading that if often people who have experienced abuse, trauma, neglect at a young age, and then have not gotten the services or support, they tend to have challenges with physical hygiene. There's lots of different things that can come into play. And again, as we were talking about socially, it can very much affect that person.
Even like reenacting, something was happened to them as a child, they're then going to do that to someone else, and unfortunately that can be a physical act as well. That psychological part of their brain just doesn't understand it wasn't okay to be done to them, so they then do it, pushing the cycle on.
Right.
It's so interesting. I was just watching, it was actually last night, I was watching a documentary about individuals who are convicted sex offenders, and they were talking a lot about their own experiences as children, the abuse that they experienced, sexual, physical abuse, and that in their minds they knew it was wrong and what they had experienced was horrifying, but then yet they went on to sexually abuse children. So it definitely has that effect.
It does. And I also think too, our view of the world becomes very distorted.
Absolutely.
And the way we view others, and we become so distrusting, right?
Absolutely.
Right. And we think, okay, no one is trustworthy. No one's going to stick with me. They will abandon me. And it makes it very difficult for these individuals to have healthy relationships.
Absolutely.
In their own head, they get into that.
And socially, some things are unofficially still very much tabooed socially. People don't want to talk about sexual abuse, or they don't want to talk about neglected children, and kids see that. They know that they're not even
Mm-hmm.
supposed to talk about what's happening to them, as a child, because
Mm-hmm.
maybe they'll get in more trouble or maybe something worse would happen. And unfortunately, even as adults, I mean, we hear stories all the time of women who were sexually abused and don't say anything because
Well, and then
they,
often
they don't
people
want to
don't
talk
believe
about it. They
them.
also don't want to be shamed for it. Like somehow
Right.
it was
There's
their
victim
fault.
shaming and absolutely.
Yeah. Well, they think if I would have done this, or if I would have done that, it wouldn't have happened. Or
Mm-hmm.
I was being too loud, or I didn't bring home the right grades. I overstepped my boundaries, and then think, well, if I wouldn't have done that, this wouldn't have happened. And also, too, in the book, um, the boy who was raised as a dog um, has that client where instead of it being unexpected, she would coerce um, the the father, the stepfather. I can't really remember.
Right.
You know,
Yeah.
Absolutely.
so she could, she would
Give her some sense of control.
Yep.
exactly
Absolutely.
and allow her to say, all right, I know when this is going to happen. I'd rather go ahead and get it over with so I can go about my own business. So we really do fall into that just to gain a sense of control.
And I think that's
Mm-hmm.
one of the hardest things with complex trauma, compared to just any trauma is hard. I think complex trauma, that extra layer is that it's done to you by someone you're supposed to trust. So
Exactly.
it's
Mm-hmm.
as a child, it's usually a parent. It can be an older sibling or a uncle, and as a community member, as an adult, it's the same thing. It can be a spouse, it can be a parent, it can be someone in your circle that you should have been able to go to when something happened to you. And unfortunately, when they're the person you're supposed to go to is the person hurting you, then you don't always have anyone else to go to.
Right. And
Yeah, I
especially,
think it can also be. Oh, I'm sorry.
oh no, it's fine. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think it can also be often, police officers or corrections officers in jails or prisons. They often are the individuals who are engaging in, the abuse and things like that. And that can be really disconcerting because they're, again, are people that you're supposed to be able to trust and go to, and they're supposed to be protecting society.
Mm-hmm. And, so at times too, they're offering support, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because they're feeding
Absolutely.
them, they're putting a roof over their head,
Mm-hmm.
they're taking them to events, taking them to go get ice cream, and then they're also experiencing this abuse. And it's very confusing. And kids need structure and discipline. And it's
Mm-hmm.
something that's pretty much like almost black and white. Like, here's what I'm supposed to do. Here's what I'm not supposed to do.
And that means really makes you distrusting and can really cause a whole lot of physical, psychological, um, emotional, and
Mm-hmm.
social issues as you grow up and as you're trying to kind of navigate the crazy world around you.
Yeah.
When that base is shaken, then everything else doesn't seem to be right or fit right in place.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. I think these are all like really amazing thoughts and points about all of the effects that complex trauma can have. I mean, it's far reaching and, without the right supports and services and interventions, this can continue and cause not only challenges for that particular individual, but any, others that they come in contact with, family members, members of their
Absolutely.
community.
It has lifelong effects, even if it doesn't happen as a child, whatever life you have
Right.
after that event, it really just shakes what you know or what you thought you knew.
Right. And your core
Absolutely.
belief of who you are.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
that will seep out into everything that you do.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I think we really covered it, emotionally, psychologically, and physiologically. of how trauma
Absolutely.
can really affect our lives and be detrimental for us.
Mm-hmm. Well, it was good talking with you.
Yeah,
Yes.
it was
Lovely.
definitely good talking with y'all. All right.
Okay.